Syrian rebels capture the strategically important city of Idlib in what's seen as a big blow to President Bashar al-Assad. Is it a sign of things to come for the government forces? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. It wasn't that long ago that the Syrian government army was making major gains across the country, with some going so far as to predict the imminent collapse of the armed opposition. But now, a group of Islamic-leaning rebels, some of them linked to al-Qaeda, have captured the important northern city of Idlib. It represents the biggest defeat of forces loyal to President Assad in 2 years and puts a vast stretch of northern Syria under rebel control. In a moment, we'll ask our guests whether rebels are slowly turning the tide against government troops. But first, Stephanie Decker explains why the fall of Idlib is just so important.
It took just 4 days for Syrian government troops to leave Idlib city. The message from Syrian state television is that they have now regrouped to the south of the city and will continue their fight against what they call terrorists. Now, who achieved this? It's a newly formed coalition formed only last week called Jaish alFateh and includes groups like the al-Qaeda affiliated Nusra Front, Ahrar al-Sham and Jund al-Aqsa. Now, it is hugely significant. Idlib city has been in the hands of the government for most of this war. It's now the second provincial capital to fall out of government hands, the first being Raqqa, that is now the effective capital of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Now, what does it mean for President Bashar al-Assad? Certainly, it will affect the army's morale. They had been besieged really in Idlib city because the opposition holds a lot of land in that province. And what does it mean for him politically? Certainly, he's made it clear. President Assad has said he's not going anywhere. He needs to be part of any negotiations. That's language we've also heard from the United States and the United Nations. But him losing land will certainly weaken his cards at any negotiation, and also it'll strengthen the hand of the opposition and those who support them. Stephanie Decker, Beirut for Inside Story.
All right, let's take a look at who controls what in the north of Syria. Rebels have now taken Idlib in the northwest, which is close to the Turkish border. It is an important city because it's close to a highway that links the capital Damascus and the commercial capital of Aleppo. It's also near the coastal province of Latakia, which is a stronghold of President Assad. And as Stephanie mentioned, this is the second northern city under rebel control. Raqqa to the east is effectively the capital of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. All right, let's bring in our guest. Joining us from Ann Arbor in Michigan, it's Juan Cole, Professor of History at the University of Michigan. In London, Davis Lewin, Deputy Director of the Henry Jackson Society. And we go to Beirut for our last guest, Sami Nada, Director of the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Good to see you there. Lots to discuss today. And Juan Cole, if we could start with you. As I say, it seems as if things have turned pretty quickly here. 1 minute we're led to believe that Assad is on the verge of routing the rebels, and now things seem to have turned around somewhat.
Yes, the forces are not evenly matched. Al-Assad's army has about 2/3 of the population under its control, but it's unable to both defend and advance, and it's repeatedly failed to do both, and so the rebels are always able to take some territory, and however it goes back and forth. We should be remembered the rebels took the strategic city of Homs, and then the regime took it back, albeit with help from Lebanon's Hezbollah.
So you wouldn't say that the tide, this latest event means that the tide is turning against Assad, or would you?
I think it would be premature to come to that conclusion. I think the fall of Idlib city doesn't threaten the regime. If they were able to use it, the rebels were able to use it as a launching pad to cut off the resupply routes from the port of Latakia to the capital, that would be significant. But at the moment, you know, the regime had already lost that province. It just continued to hold the capital of it.
Davis Lewin, what's your assessment of these latest events?
Well, I think what we're seeing is a grave, grave indictment of Western policy. Because as a matter of fact, it would have been possible not to have to make this terrible choice between Assad's forces and the Islamist forces if we had earlier on, at the time of the British parliamentary vote and when President Obama of the United States was considering whether to intervene or not, if we had bolstered some of those forces that had a more secular bent, that we could have done business with better, we would have had a chance of preventing exactly what they were telling us at the time. They were telling us that if you don't support us now, the Islamists who are better armed from the Gulf, who are more brutal, more effective on the battlefield in that way, because they have these means with the arms and the funding, are going to be able to sort of soak up all of the fighters, however ideologically committed or not they are, and make these gains, thus swallowing up the opposition and turning it into a radical Islamist type force in that way that has now taken over.
Why do you think it is so grave that they have taken the city of Idlib? Why is it such an important issue?
Well, because the fact of the matter is that you are now facing Al-Qaeda having taken over the city, fighting a war against something not better, ISIS on the other side fighting against a war against Assad, with whom we also don't want to be aligned. So none of these options are any good as far as the outcomes for peace, as far as the outcomes for freedom in the region are concerned. And as a matter of fact, it's abundantly clear that wherever these Islamists establish their rule, that a reign of terror reigns, that could have been and should have been avoided in that way. Whether it now means the reversal of Assad's fortune or indeed the complete rise of the Islamist opposition is unclear, but what is clear is that there is a vicious war raging. We see it across the region between broadly the Shia and Sunni forces, and more specifically, of course, more complicated intercommunal tensions, also, of course, on the Islamist end of the spectrum, as I say, between Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others, none of which are good options as far as stability and security in the region is concerned.
Okay, well, Sami Nada, let's come to you in Beirut. What's your perspective on this? Do you think President Assad can flush out this latest advance?
I think what happened is greatly important. Why? Because first of all, at the symbolic level, it has been a while that the opposition did not achieve a decisive victory or an important victory, and the tide was turning in favor of the regime and its allies, namely the Hezbollah, for the last months. So this is the first time the opposition make a substantial achievement. This is one. Second, now this victory would have a tremendous impact on the strategic city of Aleppo, because now Aleppo is surrounded by Raqqa on the eastern side and Idlib on the western side, and so it will be under pressure from the opposition. And if the second city like Daraa is the third in line to fall or to completely fall in the hand of the opposition, in that case the opposition would have the strategic depth in order to continue its march toward the capital, Damascus. And one more important thing, that this city has fallen in the hand of Jabhat al-Nusra. We're not talking here about ISIL. So in the larger picture, what we're witnessing is a rising power of Jabhat al-Nusra to the detriment of ISIL. ISIL has been degraded, is in its declining, we're witnessing its declining influence, while we're seeing a rising influence of Jabhat al-Nusra, and everyone says that the coalition is fighting, namely ISIL, in either in Iraq or in Syria.
Right, Sami, it's also worth pointing out, isn't it, that there could yet be a counterattack, because Assad's forces are regrouping outside the city, so we don't know that they won't successfully take the city over again.
Yes, this is true, but we know that Jabhat al-Nusra and its allies, and one more remark here, Jabhat al-Nusra seems to know how to open up to other factions on the ground and they have been preparing for the control of this city in particular. And it was quite astonishing that the troops in the troops of the regime have evacuated the region in the last 4 days. So what we've seen is a kind of decisive achievement, at least at the symbolic level, and this is quite important. And this could reverse the tide. I'm saying it could reverse the tide in favor of the opposition group, especially in light of what's happening at the very macro level. That means this coalition building in order to contain the Iranian influence in Yemen, and this could have a ripple effect on other parts of the Middle East as well.
Okay, so Lewin, I'm interested in why this has happened now. We're talking about, as we've already alluded to, these ultra-conservative rebel groups which have consolidated themselves into the so-called army of Fata. Is it this kind of joining of forces that's been a crucial component in these latest developments?
Well, I think ultra-conservative is rather a euphemism. These are terrorists of the worst kind. And it is unfortunate that we have allowed a situation in which they have now banded together because they are well funded, not least from the Gulf, because they are ideologically infused with this ideology that al-Qaeda carries, and have banded together to become an effective fighting force displacing Assad in that way. That is not in any way, shape or form. It is very important to be categorically clear here when your guests speak about the opposition in Assad. That is a hangover from the days when it was the case that the opposition meant a liberation of sorts for the Syrian people. That is no longer the case. This is not the opposition per se. This is a catastrophic reality for the people that would have to live and do now have to live under this kind of brutal rule, as we've seen in the so-called caliphate, and as we see in other areas controlled by these hardcore Islamists in that way. So I think one must be very clear categorically that this is terrible for the future of Syria, it is terrible for the region, and it will no doubt also become clear very quickly that once they are not tied up anymore in this immediate fight, they will become a threat to other actors in the region, first of all, above all, the people of Syria themselves, and secondly, may become a threat to the wider global peace and stability that we are concerned about from the regional picture already.
Okay, Wankol, what do you make of that? The opposition no longer about liberation of the people. And it's true to say, isn't it, that al-Nusra gained strength at the expense of smaller, weaker groups supported by the West. How will the international coalition be viewing these events, do you think?
Well, the international coalition has been bombing the very groups that have just succeeded in Idlib. They have run bombing raids not only against ISIL, but also against the support front, the Jabhat al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate, and the Ahrar al-Sham, or the Free Men of Syria, which also appears to have been penetrated by al-Qaeda operatives, but which forms part of what is called the Islamic Front. It's a group of fighters that broadly received some Saudi support, used to be part of the Free Syrian Army, but went in a fundamentalist direction. All of these groups have denounced democratic elections. They have said they want to establish a Sharia state, a state based on their conception of medieval Islamic law. They have killed Christians and minorities. They've targeted them. And indeed have made life miserable for secular-minded Sunnis, who are probably the majority of Sunnis in Syria. So this is, to see it as a liberation, you have to be a real partisan of the rebel forces. I think we're in a situation where there's no heroes here. The regime is brutal, it's genocidal, it's maniacal, and now the opposition is, the successful opposition is largely made up of groups that, were involved in attacking New York and Washington, D.C. in 2001.
Right, and how brutal, Sami Nada, is it for those who are living in Idlib? How will they be viewing how will they have viewed the events as they watch the advance of this group, the alFateh groups coming in?
If we take the example of Raqqa, when first ISIL get into Raqqa, they were welcomed by the Raqqa's population, and after a while, because of their brutality, the population turned against them. So, but this was ISIL. Would Jabhat al-Nusra follow the same pattern in Idlib? This has to be seen. But I have one remark, that brutality on one side is calling brutality on the other side. And as a matter of fact, is the brutality of the regime and the parties, and namely the Iranian one that are allied with the regime, are calling the brutality from the other side. This was the major driver behind the rise of Jabhat al-Nusra. We do know today that Jabhat al-Nusra is controlling Thwathis in the southern part of Syria, and now they are taking hold in northern part of Syria. And in a way, there is an indirect, I would say, a situation that is favorable for them, because the alliance the alliance that is built is waging a war against ISIL, and we haven't seen, or very rarely, a direct clash between the coalition and Jabhat al-Nusra. And Jabhat al-Nusra is seizing this opportunity to consolidating its position, whether in the southern part of Syria or in the in the western part, the border with Lebanon, in all this Al-Qalamun area in the mountain, and now they are taking hold in the northeast, northwestern part.
Okay, now I just want to bring it into Davis Lewin again. So as Sami was just alluding to there, we have these two rebel groups in control of significant areas of the north. How will ISIL be viewing this advance by people who they would regard as their opposition, and how will that relationship be affected by these latest developments?
Well, as you correctly identify, the two groups are often in open warfare with each other, and many people from both sides, indeed, in inter-ISIL versus Nusra fighting, killed in that way, although also a sort of, as is wont in these kinds of non-state movements and in these kinds of situations, a strange line of divide. Sometimes the fighters joining up, and often the fighters fighting each other. Ultimately, it's clear that ISIL will not welcome, obviously, the rise of Nusra in this way and the successes of Nusra in this way, since ISIL considers itself to be Baghdadi to be the caliph and it to run the caliphate, and that's what it will ultimately want to see. But the fact of the matter is that it is true, as one of your other guests alluded to already, that the strategic sort of overview of the region leaves much in question, because of course it doesn't make sense from the forces of moderation and sanity, frankly, wherever they are, whether in the west or in the region, only to battle one of these Islamist terrorist movements, and to leave the other one to claim that it is some kind of legitimate opposition to the Assad regime in that sense, of course. And I stress again, it makes no sense to conceive of them, of the opposition, as we had done in the past, by means of the Arab Spring and the liberation and freedoms of the people in the region that they certainly had been calling for and deserve. But it is a terrible catastrophe for the people that have to live under this rule that is ultimately going to threaten us as well as the stability of the region, and will have to be something that we will have to deal with, whether now or in due course.
So, Juan Cole, we're looking here at this group, Jaish alFateh, spearheaded by Nusra, looking to be one of the most important players on the ground, possibly usurping ISIL in strength. They are affiliated to al-Qaeda, but they're subtly different from al-Qaeda. The West will never accept a rebel ground affiliated with al-Qaeda, but they may have to negotiate with these people. So how would that work out?
Well, we're the support front, or Jabhat al-Nusra, to emerge as a very major player, and I think it's not quite there in the course of this war, were it to look like it was going to sweep into Damascus. I think a lot of diplomacy would go on to try to get it, possibly by regional actors like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, to try to get it to renounce its pledge of fealty to Ayman al-Zawahiri of al-Qaeda. Qatar has already intervened with it in that regard. in order for it to be accepted in the region, it's going to have to change those policies. Certainly, as I said, the United States is occasionally bombing it and views it as an enemy at the moment. I think there's also a danger that what we've seen in the past is that ISIL is predatory and opportunistic and often has allowed its rivals to fight the Syrian army, and then has come on the back of that and taken territory from its rivals. So I wouldn't be at all surprised to see a strike by ISIL into Idlib and an attempt by ISIL to benefit from this change.
And if that's the case, then all this is playing into President Assad's hands, isn't it?
Oh yes, well, from the very beginning, the decision of the Syrian opposition to militarize, to go to faction fighting, has not worked out well for it. And I know it's really tough to live under a totalitarian regime, a murderous regime, but they've thrown they and the regime itself have thrown the country into years of turmoil. We don't know. This could go on for another 15 years. And it would have been better to be patient and to organize underground. Now we've got unacceptable choices. ISIL is unacceptable, Al-Qaeda is unacceptable, the regime is unacceptable, and the Syrian people are suffering. As we speak, tens of thousands of people are streaming out of Idlib city who had taken refuge there from the countryside because of the faction fighting. And they're afraid both of Al-Qaeda being cruel to them and also of the regime taking revenge on the city by barrel bombing it. They drop these barrels of petroleum indiscriminately onto the population, the Syrian regime does, to punish the populations that have gone under the control of the opposition.
We're just running out of time, so I just want to push on to Sami Nada in Beirut, if I may. Apologies, Juan, but just need to move it on because we're nearly running out of time. Sami, assuming there isn't an effective rearguard action from Assad's troops, how do you see the next move for this group, for Jaish alFateh? Will they sit tight, hold tight in Idlib, or try to push on?
I think that now they can seize the momentum in order to go to another city, which is Daraa, where they have a very strong presence. And if Daraa will be the third in line and fall in the hand of Jabhat al-Nusra, that is already very influent there, in that case they have encircled Aleppo, and they build a strategic desk for their presence in Syria, and this would make out of them a major player and a major pillar for the Syrian opposition. One more remark about Jabhat al-Nusra. It has to be distinguished from ISIL. This is different. No previous clashes between Jabhat al-Nusra and the coalition. And here I refer to a Lebanese leader, Walid Jumblat, who like 1 week ago or 3 days ago said that Jabhat al-Nusra is very different from ISIL, and they are two totally different things.
So last word to Davis Lewin.
Although Jabhat al-Nusra is still kidnapping Lebanese soldiers.
We've only got 1 minute left. I apologise, but Davis Lewin. So very different. Nusra very different from ISIL. It's a different ball game with them.
Nusra and ISIL are very different in terms of that the two are at loggerheads with each other. They are no different in terms of that they are brutal, vicious Islamist terrorist movements that repress the population that they take over, that might be an effective fighting force on account of ideology and brutality, but that can under no circumstances be something that emerges as something governing people in the Middle East, whether in Syria or in Iraq, of course, and that are a grave threat to regional stability as well as to the West and other regions in terms of the ideology and the kind of rule that they seek to establish. So we must be very, very cautious about calling them the opposition and imbuing them with some kind of legitimacy by way of doing that.
All right,
the people of Syria are no better off are no better off under Nusra than they were under Assad.
Gents, I'm afraid our time is done. Our time is done. I do apologise. We have our programme is over. We cannot discuss it any further. But do appreciate your perspectives on this. We could go on for many hours, I'm sure. Thank you very much indeed. Juan Cole in Ann Arbor, Lewin in London, and Sami Nada in Beirut. Thanks very much indeed. And thank you for joining us. If you have anything you'd like to add, just go to our programme page at aljazeera.com. You can post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or indeed send your tweets to us at AJ Inside Story. I'm Nick Clark from the whole team here. It's bye for now.